I did feel awkward about that one. There have been times where people create like these bios and intros, and the entire time I'm just like, I feel awkward. So thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you all for your attention, your time, your energy today as well. It is such a joy to be back in front of so many bright minds and students, including some students that I've had the honor to teach. Can I get a shout out? Yeah, Kristen. I feel like I saw another student that I taught, Maddie. Boom, way in the back, yes. And so with that, I know that I've been before some of you before, and there will be some things that are projects that perhaps you have learned about, and there's some really cool stuff that I'm working on right now that I think you'll really enjoy. But going with today's theme, I really wanted to frame our conversation around finding our fit, and that's been something in my journey that has really influenced my ability to become a social entrepreneur as a designer, as well as navigate across different industries, because I was constantly on that search. And so a lot of people know me as what's called a social impact designer. I got my background in communications design, but life really morphed in so many ways that the focus of my work really transitioned away from designing, or like a focus on the graphics and the visuals, and more to a focus on the systems and the policies and the structures that allow things, the space to be designed and created. And so I'll talk a little bit about that, but also a part of that framing is the fact that I speak a lot, I talk a lot. If you get me in a conversation for chit chat, it's gonna be a 20-minute conversation. And I really enjoy that element of life because I come from a family of educators, and I feel that as we're learning and rediscovering or discovering so many new fields of design, it is important and imperative that we show some of those insights, that we share some of the challenges that are coming up. But I'm also an activist and a community organizer, and I'll talk a little bit about how a lot of that work, especially in terms of being considered as an artist in that framework, has really influenced who I am as a designer. And then finally, I just do a lot of cool stuff. I'm a YouTuber, and I nerd out watching like cooking channels and shows. And there was a really cool doll that was made of me earlier this year, or last year. But going back to some humble beginnings, these are two of the homes that I grew up in rural Mississippi. So I'm not from St. Louis. The one on the left is an old shack that my great-great-grandmother had in our family, and my grandmother was raised there, my mom was raised there, and as a kid, I was babysat there. I wasn't necessarily raised there. But it was an old slave shack, and to this day, this is how it looks. It's boarded up. And the home on the right is a ranch house that my family lived in, also in rural Mississippi. And these two spaces really formed my perspective on the world and the lens by which I became a creator, at first an artist and then later a designer. And getting out of those circumstances into an educational program like WashU's Sam Fox School, I struggled a lot because my framework in life had always positioned me to have to vocalize so much of who I am to people who are not like me, who hate me. Growing up in Mississippi, the town where I live, which is Cleveland, Mississippi, was segregated by a railroad track until 2012. And that's saying a lot that it stayed that way until 7 years ago. And at the same time, as a kid, I would get into fights a lot. And I'm a very nice person, but if you pick on me, if you bully me, I will fight back. And I had the support of a lot of teachers and mentors who helped me to take a lot of that angst and transform it into a visual voice. And that's what got me onto the path of design very early on. And in school, my challenges were all over the place. One was that I was a student organizer, and I had a lot of career professionals, similar to what our co-chairs were sharing earlier, who directed me into the field of advertising. And that wasn't really like my niche. And so they then said, hey, well, what if you try being an in-house designer? And I worked for Planned Parenthood as their designer. I worked for an organization called Cultural Festivals, designing all the signage that you see at the St. Louis Art Fair that's hosted in Clayton. And a lot of this was like kiosk design and things that like were new to me, but still just didn't feed that hunger to communicate about social issues. And eventually I started doing projects on my own, using a lot of the same skills that I was learning at these different jobs to start finding that voice and finding and carving that niche. And that's what got me into this work. And eventually it led me to a place of like confusion and darkness, where it was hard to find a job with a title, at least in 2010, 2011, a job where you can say, I want to be a social impact designer. And that left me in like this space where I just had to figure it out on my own. So I went back, actually, before I went back down south, there's this woman. Does anyone recognize her? My student. Yeah, Maddie. Who is this person? Yes, who said that? Yes, this is Emily Pillaton from Project H Design. How many of you have heard of Project H? A few folks. So Emily was like the first person that I ever saw, especially a person of color, that I ever saw using design for social good within the built environment. And as part of the work that she was doing, she was taking resources from communities like Bertie County in South Carolina and using things like rubber tires that had been discarded to create these learning landscapes at some of the public schools that didn't have funding to adequately teach their students math skills. She was also teaching young girls, and she still does this in Berkeley, California, but teaching young girls through her initiative called Girls Garage to learn power tools and utilize all of these parts of themselves that others in the world told them to suppress because they are girls. And I reached out to her maybe a year or so after college, and I was like, what you're doing, I really want to do. Can I meet up with you? We never met up, but she was really great in email with encouraging me to find a path to take, because entrepreneurship became her way of being able to do these amazing things that she was creating in the world. And so I went down south to rural Alabama, and you see me as like that little dark dot at the very top. And it was important that I show you this image because in terms of being the only, in my program in undergrad, I was literally the only person in my cohort that wanted to use design for social good. Everybody else was totally content and totally happy with either going into traditional graphic design, going into animation, motion, and all of these other spaces. And transitioning from that only led me to a journey where I became the only in a different context. On this team, which was for Project MLab, which was led by advertising exec and designer Jen Bielenberg, I was the only Black person on this team. I was the only queer person on this team, and we were in rural Alabama, and I was the only person on our team who had ever lived down south. And this is significant to our story because we entered into this series of projects right when a series of tornadoes had flattened most of Hale County, Alabama. And we endeavored to work with young people in order to do like Emily does and find a lot of those discarded items from around the town and rebuild different parts of what was happening, or where people spent their time. And we centered our work around community parks, and especially basketball backboards, because this town actually had an award-winning basketball team that a lot of people didn't know about, and or outside of Alabama didn't know about. And across the city or across the town, they had all of these parks that had these abandoned back or goalposts. And so we wanted to create backboards, and we call this project Common Hoops. We ran around, we taught students how to do it, how to make these backboards, and we came out with a very beautiful object. What happened though was that a lot of those racial dynamics, a lot of those social tensions, the fact that we were not invited by the community to be a part of these projects and create these things, we ended up getting kicked out while we were installing this hoop onto this goalpost. And the significance of being the only flared up in this moment, because the person who kicked us out of the park was a black male neighbor who was in his pickup truck, and after cursing everybody out, he turned to me and was like, "You should know better." And that kind of haunted me, because he was so right, and that set me on another journey. And also it set me on a journey with this disposition of failure and insecurity. And so I ended up taking time off to go to grad school. And instead of going into like an MFA program like a lot of my peers, I went into a school of social work. And throughout this experience, I started creating these projects for myself, even starting with Kickstarter, in order to just test out and experiment. Oh, there's a video of that. We're not gonna play that video, but this video was in support of Good Magazine and working in, I'm just gonna talk with that away from the screen. But it was in the Hyde Park community of St. Louis, and with that particular experimentation, we were able to help young people completely redesign this abandoned house in their neighborhood. And it ended up having a gallery space. There was a maker space. We built a garden there. And this notion of teaching young people, similar to Emily, teaching young people how to use design for good in their communities, in the spaces that were native to them, sent me to the Clinton Global Initiative. And I was recognized for this project, or this commitment to action. Ended up getting like the Visionary Award for the city of St. Louis because of some of this work. And I felt like I started to find that niche, and this became like my foundation. And at the core of this foundation of this type of work in social practice, and with looking at the built environment, and with integrating young people, I no longer became the only. I was able to be in a position to create the environment and create the culture that I wanted to work within. And with exploring that, especially with being nerdy in grad school during this time period too, I started to come up with my own thesis, which was about common cultural denominators, which are these cultural universals that, despite or in the midst of our differences, are still true and common amongst people. And this included some of the ones that are shown behind me. The fact that everyone cannot stop time. All of us are in the aging process constantly. So there are ways to use design as an intervention with looking at age in its specificity. The fact that unless we are confined to a space that disallows us to be in public, most people have to utilize public space at some point throughout their day, throughout their life. The fact that all of us are inhabited with fear, and that is a barometer that we can design in order, or redesign in order to address certain phobias and biases that we have about each other and amongst each other. The fact that we all deal with health, that art is around everybody, that we all speak a language even if that language is not verbal. We speak body language as well. The fact that everyone has a story and a purpose, and we all gotta eat. If we don't eat or we don't drink water, we perish. Those types of common universal truths that we can use as points of intervention in order to make this world better. And so with having these as a framework, I wanted to share just a few projects that have been core to this journey. So first, dealing with space and the reclamation of space. How many of you have lived here since before 2014? Oh yeah, you were students. Many of you were students in 2014. I had just finished grad school in 2014 and was ready to move away from St. Louis when Mike Brown was murdered in Ferguson, Missouri. And the ways in which our witnessing that murder, that tragedy, escalated through the media. It brought a lot of people from all across the region and ultimately all across the world into that space that was Ferguson, Missouri, and in many times Canfield Drive. And in these moments, there would be these chants, like masses of people would take over the streets in protest. And as a creator, I really started to learn just how political space can be, because when creating that visual in mass, that is an opportunity to create a collective voice, to create a collective call to action and have that be amplified. And so I started a collective called Artivist STL, Art Activists. And we would take over different parts of the street with various messages that would speak to these tensions and these issues that people, especially in this city, Black people and white people, were facing. And with participating in these activist activities, I would often have these nightmares. And in one of these nightmares, there would always be this image of this casket that was made completely out of mirrors. And so I designed it, and I had a lot of artists who helped me build it. And it was marched all across our region, all across our city, and then in other spaces across the nation, to the point that it reached this space. Does anyone know what this space is? What the brown building is? I see a head nod. I see a few heads nod. If you don't know, the space on the right, the structure on the right, is what, the Lincoln Memorial?
Washington
Memorial. And on the left is the National Museum of African American History and Culture, which was created in 2016, so it just opened. And that casket was marched around so much that it caught the attention of some very prominent activists like Angela Davis and some other authors as well, and ended up being purchased and collected into this museum, which allowed us to then invest back into a lot of the spaces and issues that were happening here in St. Louis. While this amazing thing was happening, I was also based at a museum, and something horrible was happening. The Contemporary Art Museum had invited an artist named Kelly Walker to have his works all over each gallery of its spaces. And as you can see in some of these images, he had a fixation on Black bodies. And he would smear Aquafresh toothpaste on images of Black women and smear dark chocolate and white chocolate on archival civil rights images of Black men who were being attacked by police dogs. And this became something in my own journey of looking at the space that I worked in, the space that I loved, as one to design an intervention within. And a lot of people know this secret about me, which is that I'm obsessed with sticky notes. And a lot of people from around the city came together and they sticky note bombed the interior windows of the Contemporary Art Museum here in order to speak to this notion of the racial pain and insensitivity that it was helping to promote in its space. And these types of issues, and addressing these types of issues, using these provocations that were sometimes designed, sometimes organic, but at this intersection of this work, led me to be a part of this project, which is completely different. This is the plan for what's called the Shoto Greenway, which is a new landscape development that is being created in St. Louis right now, that will stretch from Forest Park all the way to the Arch, east and west, and then from Fairground Park in the north to Tower Grove Park in the south. And this notion of using design as a way of increasing the relationships and the harmony between Black people and white people in the city, and being sensitive to those cultural nuances and the pain that has been experienced throughout all of these other years, is critical to how we are developing and designing this 5+ mile radius of greenways and parks. And that journey way back in Alabama, that necessity, that, I don't know, that passion to find my own journey led me here. That sense of always feeling like I'm the only led me to a position to help dictate how other artists, how other designers, how other community members can feel more included within the spaces across our city. When we think about, actually I have a few images of this. This shows a more spatial element of how this series of greenways will function. But when I think about how this all relates back, one of the words that really stick out is the notion of spatial equity. So how do we design spaces, both public, private, built and unbuilt, in order to increase how equity functions in the ways that we navigate and interact with each other? That has been core. And I show this museum because a lot of people don't know that St. Louis has at least one Black History Museum, and it has received a lot of disinvestment. And because of my work on this project, I now get to lead the redesign of this space. So going back to these cultural common denominators, let's focus on stories. I'm a big believer that the solutions that we want to see in our lives really does live in the stories that we tell ourselves. That if you go to any barbershop, you will have conversations with people who are concerned and caring about certain social issues, and they are talking about solutions in the midst of that. If you go to many dinner tables around the nation, there are people talking about the issues and telling stories with each other, and we have an opportunity as designers to start to take some of that data, take some of those stories, and do something with it. And so when I was a senior, in that photo that you saw me waving those were actually CD cases. Those 2 CD cases, my senior design thesis was a project called We Are Storied. And it started to influence a lot of my work as 2014 entered, with the ways in which I would address what was happening in Ferguson. And that created a project called United Story, as well as one called Faces of the Movement, where we would take people who had been in the media or photographed in the media in these moments of pain, and we would give them space. We would take them off the streets and into a studio and give them space to tell their stories themselves. And these series of interactions led into community conversations. It led into designing events and experiences where those stories started to connect with other stories, and from those connections we were able to think about strategies and policies, now leading to the work of Forward Through Ferguson. How many of you have heard of Forward Through Ferguson? So Forward Through Ferguson was initially the Ferguson Commission's report, and a group of citizens decided to create it into a nonprofit. And at the core of this work was this emphasis on storytelling. And it was projects like Faces of the Movement, United Story, Humans of St. Louis that really influenced how that work and those policies came to be. So using design, finding that niche, finding those things that are uncommon in order to create something altogether new and new possibilities for our society and our city is also a way of finding your fit. Going into systems. A lot of people know me for this project. And I always like to premise that I did not create this project, I was just the lead designer on it. And this is the St. Louis Metro Market. If you look at many maps of the city of St. Louis, you know that once you hit that line of Del Mar Boulevard, no matter if it's a public health map, an education map, a life expectancy map, a food adequacy map, the image is often the same. That the life outcomes from the southern half of our city and sometimes the western half of our city are way more advanced than the outcomes of the north side. That people on the north side are experiencing greater obesity, greater violence, greater or lower educational outcomes. And these are not necessarily things that are on the purpose of the people who live in those cities, but more so, in those parts of town, but more so the ways in which our city has been designed to ensure those types of inequities. One of those inequities that has been super important to me is about food. And it's mainly because I love food. I come from a cooking family, and when I was in the Clinton Global Initiative, I met this med school student named Jeremy, who also had a lot of concern about food inequity and the lack of food access in the north side in our city. And so he had this idea about transforming one of the public transportation buses into a mobile farmers market, and he invited me to be the designer for it. And so when we first started this project, it was like a graphic branding type project. And I'm confident in like my graphic design skills, but that's just not like my area of mastery. I'm really good at thinking about how things flow and systems. And I created this model for him because I got into the bus while it was still being gutted out. And it was like, if I am purchasing something on this bus, I don't want to come in from the front and then go out through the back in that traditional way. We created this whole new route within it, and as it was being designed and developed, it was a greater flow for community members. We designed it in a way that allowed people greater efficiency in being able to get those items that so often are not afforded to them in their neighborhoods because of the high disinvestment that has led to the loss of grocery stores. And we were able to ensure that more people can have this recognizable thing that comes into their neighborhood, and they know that this bus, which is covered with food all over it, illustrated all over it by Noah McMillan, who's also a WashU alum, that when it comes, they know that they're getting something and that people are caring about them and what they're eating and what's going into their souls and their bodies. And so that, working on that project led me into a lot of other food-based projects. One which is called Food Spark, where we host every single month a huge dinner party somewhere across the city, and we invite people to talk about social issues, creating and designing brave space for hard conversations to happen. And what we learned, and actually in this photo you can see Tim at one of our dinners. But with this work, with Food Spark, transitioning from the St. Louis Metro Market to Food Spark, it really became a matter of not just giving food to people through dinners, but also giving funding to people and their ideas. So using food as that catalyst to enforce a system of change that engages with our philanthropy systems, The fact that there are so many people in our city who have bold ideas, but they don't have a funding source. But they can actually come to a dinner, have a really good meal that's provided by others in our community, and leave one of those dinners with sometimes $2,000 and $5,000 worth of unrestricted funding to support their own efforts. And so this notion of finding these things that are common amongst us in order to disrupt inequitable systems really became core to me finding my fit, me finding my niche within the design world. So where is this leading me now? I brought these two images up like literally just this morning because a few people asked. I may be leaving St. Louis soon, and it's going to be for a few reasons. One is that I've been invited to be a cast member on a TV show on NBC called Making It with Amy Poehler and Nick Offerman. And part of the casting process of the show has really been about my own background as a creator and as a designer to affect positivity and joy and change into the world. And so I want to leave St. Louis in order to really expand that platform and share in the same ways as these projects do, the ways in which we as creators are actually affecting change. We are actually helping people feel more included and welcome into spaces. But I'm also a finalist for a fellowship at Harvard University called the Loeb. And the Loeb Fellowship is all about the built environment. And I don't bring these two opportunities up in terms to brag, but more so to bridge that sense of connection between that young person who I was confused and lost and feeling excluded as a student to that person who started to just carve paths and create experiments and create new initiatives and sometimes nonprofits and businesses in order to chart out things that were not there, that were needed in our community. And that person who found her fit by just finding what's common between us, so that when I enter a room like this one where I'm not, the majority in probably race, gender expression, sexuality, maybe age. I think we're all kind of maybe the same age. But with being in these types of spaces, to still feel like I belong and to be in a position or a disposition of belonging because I know that I can create the things that I want to see. And so that's my encouragement to you is like, how do you use this notion or that fire inside of you in order to find your fit into the world? Maybe it's not just going into a traditional design field. Maybe it's not taking a traditional job. It could be that there's an entrepreneur within you. It could be that there's an organizer within you. And all of those are just as important parts of the journey. So thank you.